Good morning, everybody. I'm going to pull my mask down so I can talk a little bit better, a little further away. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming to our first Coffee and Conversation in about 6 months. My name is Lou Roman. I'm the president of this fine establishment, and of course, Lou Roman, not to be mistaken for Lou Moyer. A few things I'd like to say. First off, anybody needs the restrooms, they're right down the hall over here. Also down the hall is our refreshments, coffee, donuts, and cookies. We're taking sanitation very seriously here, so if you see any problems, please inform somebody in a red or blue vest. And of course, as we know, masks are required. We survive on donations and have jars spread through the facility. And after the program, if you'd like to, please take a look at all the new displays that we have upstairs. I'd like to introduce Mike Fellows, who has done an outstanding job setting all this up for the streaming and everything for our first Coffee and Conversation in 6 months. Thank you for being here.
Yes, no, I need that. Thank you again for joining us and for being brave enough to come on out and join us, particularly at the museum. We hope we're going to be able to continue our Coffee and Conversations in the future. And again, I'd just kind of like to remind everyone that we are open Thursdays 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And please, if you're at all around this area, please stop in. We normally always have coffee, probably some cookies and items. Stop by, and even if you just want to sit in our library for a bit, we have quite a collection of movies, documentaries that we could readily show. If you want to do any sort of research online, we can kind of help you with some of that. But we have a marvelous resource here, and we would just like to hopefully continue starting to use this. Again, we're so fortunate to have John join us again, and I'll talk a little bit more related to John, because he's given a variety of talks with us, which have all been quite marvelous. But I'd like to highlight, we do have some others coming up that we hope you'll join us with. On September 26th here, similar to what you're seeing, our own Flint Whitlock, who's a noted historian and editor of the World War II Quarterly magazine, will give a special talk he's put together entitled Colorado's Contributions to Victory in World War II. So again, I think that'll be a great talk. And then in October, we have a very special event. The city has allowed us to use the Broomfield Auditorium. I got to remind myself. And so at 10 a.m., not our normal 9 a.m., we have kind of a dual presentation. Colleen Sawyer and Shirley Jamel, both who have given marvelous talks here, and are going to give a special one related, as you can see, a view of World War II through women's eyes on both sides of the Atlantic. And we hope that you'll join us for that. Attendance is much greater, about 40 plus people. So just please join us for that. We will be posting future Coffee and Conversation schedule on our website as well. And then just, how to contact us. Certainly just getting on our website, or you could do to any Lou Roman. In fact, our introductions, our board president, John Petticolas, our board vice president, and David Jamel, who's head of our education committee. So again, thank you very much for joining us. I'll set up your talk, John. And we have a brief biography of John here that I hope you'll read. I won't go through it all, but again, John's had a master's degree in museum and archival management, has worked as curator and archivist at the Cincinnati Art Museum and Cincinnati Historical Society, and was also the administrator of the Hiwan Homestead Museum. And as you can see, John is quite involved with a variety of reenacting groups, and one particularly related to our kind of early history here. So without further ado, let me get you set up, John. Thank you. Okay.
Got it?
Yep.
Well, I guess you do.
Guess we do.
Wow. All right. Well, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming out today. It's just wonderful to be able to present a live, as they say, before a live studio audience, and that you braved the plague and pestilence and all the other things going on to come out. It's flattering to me, and it's an honor to me to see so many people here. And I'd like to call attention to one, and that's Bob Mulder, right here in the front row, so that he can heave things over this thing and hit me with them. But Bob is not only a Korea War veteran, he is also a COVID veteran. So, and I understand what happened. Yeah, I understand what happened, Bob, is COVID took one look at you and ran the other way.
That's right.
Is that true? Yes, I thought so. Well, this is kind of the third in a trilogy of talks that I've given here about war on the Western frontier. The first one was about the Revolutionary War in the West. The second was about the Indian Wars in the Ohio country in the 1790s. And this one is about the War of 1812, so I think this will be the last in that series. And as you might remember, the last time I outlined what was happening after the Revolutionary War is that Congress was creating the Northwest Territory and authorizing land sales, and settlements were beginning to gather north of the Ohio River. Cincinnati, Marietta, and the other some of which are now the major cities of Ohio, were starting to be founded. And there were certain people who were not real happy about this because they had been promised repeatedly during the Revolutionary War, don't worry, we're from the government, we're here to help you. There will never be any white settlement north of the Ohio River. Well, guess what?
Let me just
move you
over a little more.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that. And as these settlements began to spread throughout Ohio, a war broke out in 1790 that was going to inflame the whole Northwest Territory for the next 5 years. After there were two major defeats of the United States Army by the Indian forces in that region, and the Army was shattered and demoralized, and it was reorganized and retrained by Major General Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony, into the Legion of the United States. And the organization was based on the old Roman legions. And with this force, and with the addition of the Kentucky Mounted Volunteers, Wayne and his forces were able to meet the assembled Indian forces, the warriors, at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers just south of present-day Toledo, Ohio, on August 20th of 1794, a date that everybody in Ohio learns, and defeated the Indian forces and the Detroit militia that had joined them under British leadership. So after that, the Treaty of Greenville allowed white settlement in about 3/4 of present-day Ohio. And as the great Ottawa chief, Ogishaway, had warned back in 1791, don't let the white people into your territory. If you do that in a space of years, there will be no more Indian people in that region. They're going to crowd you out and they're going to take over. And that's exactly what happened. Over the next 15 years or so, Indiana and Michigan were broken off as separate territories. Ohio became a state in 1803, and the governors of those separate entities, Thomas Worthington in Ohio, William Henry Harrison in Indiana, and Lewis Cass in Michigan negotiated treaties with various Indian leaders that turned millions, and I mean millions of acres of Indian land over to the United States government and to the various state and territorial governments. And there were some people who were extremely concerned and alarmed about this. Let me go ahead a little bit and talk about that. I'm trying to find, apparently I am missing a slide here. Okay. Let me talk about a couple of people who were concerned about this. No, here we are. There were two brothers who were Shawnee Indian warriors and leaders from the Chillicothe band of the Shawnee tribe in central Ohio. And one of them, and the original leader, was Tenskwatawa. Tenskwatawa means he who opens the door in the Shawnee language. And Tenskwatawa was seen as kind of a worthless, idle type of person. In the tribe, he wasn't given much respect until he became very ill. He fell into a coma. And when he recovered from the coma and awakened, he said that he had been allowed to visit the spirit world. And the creator of life had told him how to tell the Shawnee people to regain their respect and their former power and to return to their ways that they had before the whites invaded their country. So he became the spiritual and cultural leader of a resistance movement among the Shawnee that spread to many of the other tribes in the Ohio River and Great Lakes region. His brother, Tecumseh, who was seen here brandishing his tomahawk in a treaty negotiation with William Henry Harrison, something that probably never happened. Tecumseh was a renowned warrior among the Shawnee people. He was not a chief, but he was seen as a very strong leader. And if Tenskwatawa, his brother, who became known as the Shawnee prophet or just the prophet, was the spiritual and cultural leader, Tecumseh was the military and diplomatic leader of this resistance movement. So those are some of the things that were happening among the Indian people there. After all these land cessions and treaties were happening, they were beginning to gather followers and to communicate with other tribes besides the Shawnee to try to create a unified American Indian response to this huge white takeover of what had been their rightful land. Now, there were other things boiling on the international scene at this time. The United States had a lot of grievances against Great Britain. Remember, right now, we're in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. Great Britain is fighting Napoleon and the French, and they feel that they have to keep up their Royal Navy to the utmost peak in order to foil Napoleon's designs to take over Europe and the world. So they need manpower. Where are they going to get this manpower? It's difficult to get it in England. Service in the Royal Navy is tough. You sometimes are at sea for years at a time. There's extremely strict discipline. You could be flogged half to death for just a very minor offense. The food is terrible. Rotten salt pork and ship biscuit full of weevils. The pay is terrible also, and sometimes you go for a very long period of time without pay. So people are very reluctant to join the Royal Navy. In England, what they do is impressment. They send armed press gangs around the waterfront, grab whoever they can find in the local tavern, drag them off to the ship and say, "You're now in the Navy." "Oh, thanks." And they're doing the same thing to American sailors. By 1812, about 10,000 American sailors had basically been kidnapped by Royal Navy ships that stop American merchant ships and grab the best-looking, muscular, best sailors among the Americans and drag them off to join the Royal Navy. So this is an extreme focus of grievance for the American people against the British Empire. There's another focus, and that is there are quite a few attacks still going on, just small raids, stealing horses, killing people, plundering, looting, going on by American Indians, and back and forth raids. And the rumor is that the British are paying the Indians to take American scalps. This is not true, but it is the rumor, and people believe it. As they say, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So there's a whole number of grievances that we have, and there's a general feeling in the United States, which, I mean, if you look at it at this time, is still a small, weak nation, that we're being batted back and forth like a football between the French and the British in this international struggle for dominance. So this leads to a lot of grievance, a lot of anger, and a lot of political movement. And who do we have leading this political movement? We have some of the war hawk gentlemen right here who are in Congress. We have John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. We have Henry Clay of Kentucky. We have William Crawford of Georgia. And we have Richard Mentor Johnson of Kentucky. And these are some of the leaders of the war hawks in Congress who are saying, for our national honor, for our national even survival as an independent country, we must declare war. Well, who do we declare war on? At one point, they were urging President Madison to declare war against England and France, equal time. Well, how would that have ended up? But they do have a lot of influence in Congress, and a lot of people are listening to them. And there was a parallel call for war among the Indian tribes, as I mentioned before, with the prophet, Tenskwatawa, and Tecumseh. Tecumseh is traveling south to talk to the Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws down there in Georgia and Tennessee, and saying, hey, join the Shawnee and the other tribes in the Ohio River region. Let's get together, form a unified diplomatic and military response to what the United States is trying to do to us. So this causes a lot of alarm along the frontier, and to head off this threat, Governor William Henry Harrison of Indiana gathers the 4th U.S. Infantry and some of the Indiana militia to threaten the Prophet's Village in northern Indiana, which leads to the Battle of Tippecanoe in November 1811. And in a sense, the war started probably at that time. Now, during the summer, Harrison assembled a force of about 950 territorial militia and regular infantry, and in September, he marched north from Vincennes up the Wabash River toward the Prophet's Town, which was the big Indian village where the prophet had his authority centered, near the Tippecanoe River. Tecumseh was away down south talking to the Creeks. But on November 6th, the army reached the area around Prophetstown, and a delegation from the prophet came up to talk to Harrison. And, you know, this is, if you think about military strategy, if you have an army and you want to know where to encamp, do you ask your potential enemy where that camp ought to be? But that's exactly what Harrison did. He talked to these delegates from Prophetstown and said, where do you think I ought to camp, guys? And they said, oh, there's a nice flat area over there by the river surrounded by woods. Yeah, that would be a really, really good place to camp. So, of course, Harrison goes over there and has the army encamp in an open area surrounded by woods. Luckily, he learned something from his service under Anthony Wayne, and he had the troops camp in a rectangular formation and build breastworks of brush and logs around the camp. So that's probably what saved the army. About 4 a.m. the following morning, November 7th, hundreds of Indians encircled the camp and attacked while it was still dark. Now, what the prophet had told his warriors was, I have really strong magic, medicine, that's going to protect you. All right? The soldiers in the camp will not be able to see you and they won't be able to shoot you. So you're not going to take any casualties. And that's exactly what happened. The troops inside the camp were outlined against their campfires. Outside, it's still dark. The army cannot see the Indians who are shooting at them. So as it starts out, this is going exactly the way the prophet said it would. The other thing he said, look, we got to kill Harrison. If we don't kill Harrison and he gets away, he's hitting us with a hammer here. He's going to come back with a sledgehammer. So we got to get rid of him. He always rides a white horse. So he had a special group of Indian sharpshooters who were scheduled to go in there and shoot Harrison and kill him. Well, several things happened. Number one, dawn breaks. The soldiers inside the camp can now see the Indians, shoot at them, and start dropping them. And an aide-de-camp to Harrison, another officer, is sent by Harrison to send a message to some of the troops on the line. And he grabs, his horse becomes unmanageable, it's frightened. So he grabs Harrison's white horse, jumps on it, and gallops off to tell the troops this order. Well, the Indian sharpshooters see him, white horse, Harrison. They shoot him, Harrison lives. Rallies the troops, counterattacks. Indian warriors are like, wait a minute, this is not happening the way the prophet said it would. We're getting shot down. We're leaving. Goodbye. So they go back to the village. They grab the prophet. They beat him up. They truss him up to a log and carry him off in captivity to Canada. And Harrison goes in, burns the village. This was a narrow escape for Harrison and his army. He portrays it as a great giant victory for the United States. And so he gets the nickname Old Tippecanoe. And in 1840, what's the campaign cry going to be when he runs for president? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Okay, there it is. Now, in 1812, April of 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain. The war began at sea. This is the Battle of the USS Constitution against the HMS Guerriere, which, as we all know, the Constitution blew the Guerriere out of the water and sank her. Supposedly, the British 18-pounder cannonballs bounced off the sides of the Constitution, and she became known as Old Ironsides, right. So, as the war begins, as Harrison said of Kentuckians, every Kentuckian goes insane at the sight of an Indian. There was deep hatred, deep passionate hatred by Kentuckians against Indian people. And this goes back decades to the Revolutionary War and even before. So the Kentucky Volunteers during the previous war in the 1790s had been led by General Charles Scott. And so Scott is now the governor of Kentucky as the War of 1812 begins, and he calls up thousands of Kentucky volunteers who enthusiastically volunteer. So many of them volunteer that many of them had to be sent home for lack of supplies and equipment. Eventually, 5 out of 6 Kentucky men of military age would serve during the War of 1812. And that's a remarkable percentage. So the Kentucky Volunteers are enthusiastic. They're volunteering, coming in swarms. And William Henry Harrison puts out, I'm going to lead an expedition that will solidify our hold on the old Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and we will defeat the Indian forces and the British and sweep them out of this region. Great, wonderful. Except the War Department in Washington says, hold on, wait a minute, you're the governor of Indiana, you're not a military commander in the United States Army, you're not in command of any troops formally during this war. So the two people, fatefully, that they have appointed, General William Hull is in charge of the American troops around Detroit, and General James Winchester is in charge of the troops moving up to recapture Detroit after. William Hall was 59 years old. He was in charge of the troops in the Detroit area, and a large Indian and British force assembled across the Detroit River from the fort and sent in a message saying, if you don't surrender, this is from General Isaac Brock, who was the British commander, and he tells Winchester, look, if you don't surrender and we capture the fort, I can't control my Indians. They're going to come in, you have women and children in there, they're going to be killed and scalped, all kinds of horrible things are going to happen, and you better surrender right now. And Tecumseh has his warriors raise a war cry and demonstrate there, and William Hull surrenders Fort Detroit and a couple of thousand American troops without firing a shot. So this is just a great beginning to the War of 1812 in the West. General Winchester leads his troops up to try to retake Detroit, and they get attacked at a place called Frenchtown in Michigan, just a little bit south of Detroit. The troops, Winchester is in a nice comfy house a couple of miles away from his troops. They get attacked, they get overwhelmed, defeated, many of them were captured, and afterwards many of them are killed and mutilated by Indians, many of the wounded Americans. So this leads to this is right near, by the way, the River Raisin in Michigan, and this leads to the Kentucky battle cry for the rest of the war, remember the River Raisin. So we're faced with disaster here along the western frontier at the beginning of the War of 1812. Nothing seems to be going right. Our commanders are substandard. Our militia troops are untrained. What we need is some good, solid, disciplined, regular troops allied with volunteers from Kentucky, which is what won the previous Indian War in the 1790s under Anthony Wayne. And we need a strong commander who can pull all these forces together. And finally, the War Department sees the light and says, okay, Harrison, you're in charge of all the troops on the northwestern frontier. And he takes over. And he has, and this is the reconstructed Fort Meigs. This is just south of Toledo, along the Maumee River at the head of the Maumee Rapids. Now, what the story is up there geographically, Lake Erie, the Maumee River flows into Lake Erie. And right about a little bit south of Toledo, there's some limestone shelves that run across the river that are known as the Maumee Rapids. That's the head of navigation. You can come in by boats down or up the river from Lake Erie, but when you get to that point, you have to portage around the Maumee Rapids. And right at that point, Harrison had built a huge wooden and earth fortification that he called Fort Meigs after the governor of Ohio. And this is the reconstruction of Fort Meigs, which the Ohio Historical Society insanely did back in the 1960s when they were flush with money. This was the largest wooden fortification ever built in North America. So they reconstructed this whole thing, and which is amazing and wonderful, but it's a huge drain on the finances of the Ohio Historical Society. So he had this fortification built right at the point where the British and Indians would have to stop and move around before they could get up the river. And in May of 1813, the Indians and the British came down from Detroit and laid siege to Fort Meigs. And the Kentuckians came up and formed part of the garrison there. Again, they had a kind of a mixed record there. A number of them went across the river in boats to attack the British batteries there, the artillery. They managed to overrun the British positions and capture the artillery. And then a couple of Indians came out of the woods and went and ran back in the woods. And every Kentuckian goes insane at the sight of an Indian. So these Kentuckians broke up into little groups and scattered around chasing the Indians. And of course, who's hidden back in the woods? Tecumseh's warriors, a couple of thousand of them. They overwhelm all these Kentuckians, capture them, and are starting to tomahawk and kill them until Tecumseh comes up and orders them to stop doing that. So, which is one of the reasons Tecumseh was a figure, he was an individual who was extremely respected, not only by the Indian people among whom he lived, but also by the British and their officials and soldiers, and also by the Americans all along the frontier. Everybody respected Tecumseh very deeply. Now, in July, the British and Indians came back. After they had to lift this siege, they could not overwhelm Fort Meigs in May. So they came back in July and tried to lure the garrison out of the fort and form an ambush. The garrison in Fort Meigs didn't take the bait. They stayed in the fort. So the British failed. So they went over to the east to the Sandusky area and attacked Fort Stevenson, which was a small fort led by a 21-year-old Army officer named George Crowan. And there were only 160 Americans inside the fort. There were about 2,500 Indians and British. So General Proctor, who was in charge of the British, ordered a frontal assault on the fort, which failed miserably. The British took about 100 casualties. The Americans lost 2. And so this was a terrible failure for the British. Indians were disheartened. They moved back up to Detroit. Then in September 10th of 1813, the great victory, the Battle of Lake Erie, off the shore of Ohio, where the American fleet led by Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry totally overwhelmed the British fleet, and Perry, in the middle of the battle, when his flagship became disabled, he got in a little rowboat in the middle of all this cannon fire and went over to the Niagara, the other ship. His flagship was the Lawrence. He rowed over to the Niagara, took over command of that, moved it in, and defeated the already battered British ships and sent the famous message to William Henry Harrison, "We have met the enemy and they are ours." The Battle of Lake Erie. So the log jam in the northwest frontier was broken. The Americans had control of Lake Erie. Perry ferried Harrison's army into Canada. They took over Fort Malden, and this is the remains of Fort Malden, Ontario, as it is today, just outside Kingston. And it's very beautifully taken care of and interpreted by the Canadian Park Service, which has full funding and support and all the money that it needs from the national government of Canada. Editorial comment. Now, General Proctor was short of food. He was trying to support not only the British troops in the fort, but also the Indian forces and their families. He just did not have the means to stay there. So he decided to retreat to the east to meet up with the other British forces in that direction. Tecumseh was indignant at this. He says, "You're like a fat animal that puts its tail between its legs and runs. Stand and fight and you'll win." No, Proctor decided to retreat. Harrison's army followed him up. And now in Britain they call it Thames. In Canada they call it the Thames. All right, so along the Thames River, near a Delaware Indian village called Moraviantown, the U.S. forces caught up with the British and Indians, and what ensued was the Battle of the Thames. There was a thin British line of soldiers who were overwhelmed by the Kentucky Mounted Volunteers, who had this tactic they had developed under Colonel Richard Mentor Johnson, who had been one of the War Hawks congressmen was the commander of this regiment of Kentucky Volunteers. And he had trained them to charge through the enemy lines, wheel around, and fire into the backs of the enemy. And this is the tactic they used successfully at the Battle of the Thames. Now, Colonel Johnson himself was with what was called the Forlorn Hope in another part of the battlefield, which was a thick woods and swamp. And the Indians were concealed there. This is where most of the Indian forces were. And so he sent in what was called a Forlorn Hope. About 24 men volunteered to go in, to charge into this area and draw the enemy fire so that Johnson could see where they were concealed. Now, if you were Richard Johnson, you're the commander, you're the colonel of this regiment. Okay, think about this. Would you stay behind, order these guys to go in toward almost certain death, or would you ride in with them to show that you're not telling anybody to go where you wouldn't go? Which one would you choose?
I'd stay behind.
Well, of course you would, Bob. What would you do back there?
I would go with my soldiers and be a good leader.
Good for you. Good for you. Can we have a round of applause for this young man? And that is exactly what Richard Mentor Johnson did. He rode in on a gray horse with his troops as the Forlorn Hope to draw the Indian fire. And when he rode, he was wounded 4 times. He was shot 4 times. His horse was shot. And as it was drooping down, as you can see, it's been shot here, an Indian warrior came running up at him with an upraised tomahawk. And Johnson raised his horse pistols, fired, shot the Indian through the heart, and killed him. And after the battle, they were going over this area with Harrison and others and said, oh, that's Tecumseh. Colonel Johnson, you killed Tecumseh. So did he really kill Tecumseh? Or did somebody else? Tecumseh was shot through the chest and through the head. Shot twice. So who gave him the fatal shot? And was this Tecumseh? By the time they looked at the body, it was swollen, bloated, and the Kentuckians, being Kentuckians, had come up with their knives and cut strips of his skin off as trophies. So the body was mutilated, bloated, and swollen. Is this really him? Harrison said, I can't really say if that's him. And when they asked Johnson about it later, he said, how do I know? He said, when he came at me with his tomahawk, I didn't have the time to ask him his name and the health of his family. I shot him. So how do I know? But Johnson took it and ran with it. And when he became vice president of the United States and went on the campaign trail, he would tear open his shirt to show his wounds, his scars from the War of 1812. And everybody would yell, Rumsey Dumpsey, Rumsey Dumpsey, Colonel Johnson killed Tecumseh, woo! So whether he did it or not, he got the credit. Now, as a follow-up to this, the next year, George Crowan, our by now 22-year-old, was sent with an Army force and a naval force to recapture Fort Mackinac on Mackinac Island in Michigan. If you're familiar with this area, right up at the Straits of Mackinac. And it controls that area between, you're going to correct me here, Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. Am I right? Anyway, well, we'll take it as true. So if you want to travel between the lakes, you have to go past Fort Mackinac, and they have heavy guns positioned up there. The American naval force could not train its guns high enough to hit the fort, which was up on this bluff. So that's a failure. They were driven away by wind and storm for about a week. When they came back, they landed on the other side of the island, and tried to make it to the fort, but they were ambushed by British and Indian forces and forced to retreat back to their ships, and it was a total failure. Fort Mackinac stayed under British control for the rest of the war. The forts along the western frontier are isolated, and they're being evacuated. In 1813 and 14, Fort Osage, which is just up the Missouri River from Kansas City, was evacuated. Fort Madison in Iowa, which is now the city of Fort Madison, was evacuated after a very heavy Indian attack led by Black Hawk. And Fort Johnson on the Mississippi River was also evacuated. Now, there in central Missouri, there's an area around Arrow Rock. Anybody been to Arrow Rock? If you hadn't been to Arrow Rock, you need to go, because it's one of those places where the clock stopped about 1900 and never started up again. Okay? So the old Houston Tavern is there, which has been in business along the Santa Fe Trail there since 1834. So it's a great place to go and soak up some history. Anyway, that's what was called the Boons Lick area of Missouri. And it was called Boons Lick. Now, I know what's going through your minds, but put that aside. Boons Lick was created because Daniel Boone's sons, Daniel Morgan Boone and Nathan Boone, started up a big industrial salt manufacturing works there at a salt lick. So it was called Boons Lick. And the towns of Arrow Rock, there were a lot of other small communities there, and they were getting heavily attacked by the Sauk and Fox Indians, mostly led by Black Hawk. They had to put up a pretty stout defense at times. They were ordered by the governor of Missouri Territory to evacuate. You people are too vulnerable. You have to evacuate and move back to St. Louis. They refused. Colonel Sarshall Cooper wrote back to the governor, and here's what he said. "We have made our homes here, and all we have is here, and it would ruin us to leave now. We be all good Americans, not a Tory or one of his pups among us. And we have 200 men and boys that will fight to the last. And we have 100 women and girls that will take their places with them. Makes a good force. So we can defend the settlement. With God's help, we do so." And they did. They stuck it out there. There were many Indian raids onto individual little settler forts that they set up and cabins, but they managed to struggle through and stay there during the War of 1812. Now here's something you probably have never heard of. Governor William Clark of the Missouri Territory, yes, that William Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition, ordered in St. Louis a number of keel boats. He bought these for the territorial government, had them armed with small cannon, and used them to patrol up and down the Mississippi River to try to scout and find out what the British and Indians were up to and intercept them if they tried to move back and forth across the river. So he had a small fleet, about a dozen of these patrol boats going up and down the Mississippi River. My wife back there, Mary, is from Davenport, Iowa, and I learned a little bit more about this, and I called her. I was at a War of 1812 conference where they gave a little talk about this. And I said, "Hey, honey, guess what happened at Davenport, Iowa, your hometown?" And she's like, "What?" And I said, "They had a battle there during the War of 1812. And she was terribly excited to learn that. Yeah. Yes, you might say she was almost overwhelmed to the point where she was speechless.
I doubt that.
So, what happened here in September of 1814, and by the way, this is the Quad Cities area. The Quad Cities in Iowa, it's Davenport and Bettendorf, And in Illinois, it's Rock Island and Moline. And on Rock Island, there was a huge Indian village of the Sauk and Fox people called Saukanock. All right, so this is kind of an area that the patrol boats want to check on. So they're up there September 14th of 18... And by the way, let me just go ahead a little bit. Did I not put that in? Yes, I did. And then let me just talk about this area here on the western frontier and show the map. Okay, up here is Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. The Americans have a fort there that's taken over and captured by the British. Down here is Saukanock, that's Rock Island, and here's Credit Island. Over here is Fort Osage on the Missouri River. Down here is Camp Bellefontaine, the big Army base near St. Louis. And 7, I'll talk about that a little bit later. 6 is Fort Johnson, another small American fort that was abandoned during the War of 1812. So this is a little bit of an idea of the area that I'm talking about. Okay, and here at Credit Island, now previous to this, the American Army had sent a force of regular troops up the Mississippi River to try to recapture Prairie du Chien from the British. And they were ambushed and attacked by Black Hawk, and his Sauk and Fox warriors took quite a few casualties. Their commander, Major Zachary Taylor, ordered them to return back to base. So all we have on the river right after that is these patrol boats, and 2 of them were moving up the river and were attacked right here near Credit Island. Black Hawk, and by the one boat was badly managed and managed to run aground. Oh boy. And Black Hawk put together some flaming arrows. Believe it or not, this doesn't only happen in Hollywood. He put together some flaming arrows and set the sail of that particular ship on fire. Pretty soon the whole ship was in flames, and it was under heavy attack. The second patrol boat was well managed to move back in, circle back, and pick up the survivors and move back down the river. And Black Hawk said and I cannot remember the name of the man who was in command of the second boat, if I ever knew it, but Black Hawk said afterward, that man really knew how to manage his boat and was very brave to come back and pick up the survivors. If I ever meet him, I would like to shake his hand. So that was the Battle of Credit Island. Now the next day, some more patrol boats came up the river, 2 or 3 of them, to try to salvage what might remain from the first boat that had been captured by the Indians. By this time, British troops had arrived from Prairie du Chien with a cannon that they set up on the Iowa side of the river and started shelling these American patrol boats, who then turned tail and fled back down the river. So that's the 2-day Battle of Credit Island in Iowa. Okay. Who knew? War of 1812 at Iowa. Now, meanwhile, what's happening back east? Well, the British fleet is in control of Chesapeake Bay. They land a force of a couple thousand British troops and Marines. They meet the American militia at Bladensburg, Maryland. And the militia does what the militia is supposed to do. It's their job. They throw down their guns and run away as soon as they see the British marching up. So the British march into Washington, D.C. They burn the White House. They burn the Capitol. They burn the Treasury building and all the other public buildings in Washington except the Marine Barracks and the Patent Office. And the head of the Patent Office ran up to the Patent Office building and stood in the doorway as the British came up and said, "Stop! The patent models inside are private property. You can't touch those or burn them." The British were like, "Oh, well, we didn't know that. Okay, well." And they marched away. So the Patent Office was saved. The Marine Barracks, the legend about the saving of the Marine Barracks is that the British had so much respect for the United States Marine Corps that they refused to burn the Marine barracks at the Washington Navy Yard. No. A couple of ladies who lived next door came over when the British marched up and said, look, if you burn the Marine barracks, our house is going to go too. Please don't do that. So the British said, okay, we won't. And that's the story. But so Washington, D.C. is captured, all the public buildings are burned. Now, almost the same time in September of 1814, a massive British army is moving south from Canada. And the British fleet on Lake Champlain gets to Plattsburgh, New York, a major naval base for the Americans, and it's fortified pretty well. And there's a big naval battle on Lake Champlain. Again, the Americans, surprisingly to everybody, the Americans totally win. They disable and capture all the British ships. The commander of the British Army, who has intended to invade New York and move down, maybe even capture New York City, says, I don't want to get caught like General Burgoyne did back during the Revolutionary War, moving south into New York and getting encircled and cut off. If I don't have command of Lake Champlain, that's what's going to happen. So he turns his army around and moves back up to Canada. And that saves the state of New York from invasion. So the Battle of Plattsburgh, or the Battle of Lake Champlain, as it's sometimes called, is one of the unknown battles, but very crucial in American history. What else is happening? The British attempt to take the port of Baltimore. They have to get past Fort McHenry at the entrance to the harbor if they're going to do that. They land troops. Their land attack fails, sputters out when their commander is killed. And so they decide to move in and take over Baltimore. So they bombard Fort McHenry all night. In the morning, Francis Scott Key, a young lawyer from Baltimore, sees the American flag still flying over the fort by the dawn's early light, realizes the fort is not surrendered, the British can't make it in and take Baltimore. And he pens a little poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry, which is later put to a British club song, a little anthem called the Anacreontic Song, and somebody along the line renames it the Star-Spangled Banner. But peace negotiations are going on in Ghent, Belgium. Very able negotiators from the United States, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. The result is favorable to the United States. Everybody returns to the status quo ante bellum, the way things were before the war. The United States does not lose any territory, even though we had many defeats. And the treaty is signed on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1814. But nobody in the United States knows that, right? So on the 8th of January, the British attack and try to take New Orleans, attacking the American defensive works outside New Orleans, commanded by General Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans, which is really the biggest battle of the War of 1812. Now, you hear it all the time, well, this happened after the war was over. No, because the Treaty of Peace was not ratified and signed by President Madison until February. So while this happens, the war is still on. The British lose a couple of thousand casualties. The Americans take 33 casualties, I believe. So this was an overwhelming defeat for the British. They retreat, get back in their fleet, and take off for parts unknown. But on the western frontier, nobody knows this has happened. Nobody knows there's a peace treaty. There's been a raid by some Sauk and Fox Indian warriors in one of the settlements in the Missouri Territory, down in this area, just a little bit northwest of St. Louis. And the Missouri Rangers follow up on these Indian warriors. The Missouri Rangers were kind of the same type of troops as the Kentucky Volunteers. they were paid by the U.S. government. They weren't militia paid by the state. They were enlisted by the U.S. government. And so this was the forerunner to all the different volunteer regiments that were going to serve in the war with Mexico and the Civil War. Anyway, the Missouri Rangers follow up on these Indian warriors, and the warriors take cover in a big sinkhole down here near what was called, that area. And I've lost, I'm sorry folks, I've kind of lost what this area, this little cape, it's called Cape something or other. But anyway,
Cape
no,
Girardeau.
is that Cape Girardeau? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, it is. Yeah, that's where the home of Rush Limbaugh, yeah. And you just thought I'd throw that in. That's also part of history. But anyway, so they take Black Hawk and his Sock and Fox warriors take refuge in this sinkhole where they can fire up at the Missouri Rangers. The Missouri Rangers are trying to get close enough to fire down into the sinkhole, but they're being held back by the Indian fire. So what are we going to do? Some of these brilliant guys come up with this contraption. All right, what they did was take an old wagon that was abandoned nearby, and they flipped up the wagon bed and nailed it down to the axle and put some embrasures in it that they could fire through with their muskets or rifles, and wheeled it up to the edge of the sinkhole thinking, aha, they can't, their rifle fire will bounce off the wooden wagon bed, and then we can shoot down at them with impunity. They won't be able to hit us. Well, what they forgot was the bottom of the thing isn't armored. So the Indians can just shoot up through here and hit the guys who are trying to roll this thing forward. Total failure. They lose several men trying to do this and give it up. So as night falls, the Indians are able to crawl out of the sinkhole through a small cave and get away. There's all kinds of different casualty estimates on this. Black Hawk says we lost one guy. The Missouri Rangers say, oh, we killed 5 of them. Who knows? But anyway, this was a battle in 1815, May 24th of 1815. Actually, this battle was fought after the war was over because the Treaty of Peace had been signed. So the aftermath of the war, Washington, D.C. is rebuilt. The men who had led the American forces during the war become the political leadership of the United States for about the next 30 years. Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Richard Mentor Johnson, Lewis Cass, all these men become great political leaders. Jackson and Harrison are elected president. Richard Mentor Johnson is elected vice president under Van Buren. Lewis Cass becomes a senator. And Henry Clay, of course, has a huge, long political career and runs for president 3 times. So the legacy of the War of 1812, many legacies. But one of them is the frontier is pacified for the time being. Treaties of peace are signed with all the Indian tribes who participated, and so the way west is opened for American settlers. And it devolves into the usual pattern of whites moving in, taking over Indian land, Indian resistance, moves west further and further, and guess where it ends up? To a great extent. This is the Battle of Beecher's Island in southeastern Colorado in 1867. Am I right?
I thought it was 66, but it doesn't make any difference.
Anyway. Well, I'm, okay. Let me be, I stand corrected by Bob Mulder. So the pattern remains, and this will keep going and keep going. The legacy of the War of 1812 and white advancement into Indian country comes to Colorado in the 1860s, moves up to Wyoming, Montana, down into Oklahoma, and what we end up with is what we have now. is where the Indian people who once controlled this huge region are now confined to godforsaken rat holes called reservations. And I don't want to end up on a negative note, but there it is, folks. That's the way it is. Okay. And that's what I have to say. What do you have to say?
Any questions?
Yes.
Would you like?
Any questions? Yeah, Bob has a question.
When was the Black Hawk War?
The Black Hawk War was in 1832. 1832. And one of the people who participated in that war was a young... Yes, right, an officer in the Illinois militia, Abraham Lincoln. Yes, and I never saw any real action. His company, I think, buried some dead soldiers who had been killed by Indians, and that's about all that they did. But yes, Abe Lincoln, and there's a great comic book I have from when I was a kid, Star Spangled War Stories, and it has this whole story about Abe Lincoln and the War of the Black Hawk War, which is totally fictional, but it was a cool story to read when I was a kid reading a comic book. Anyway. And one of the things that happened in that war, the cholera epidemic of that year came west with the troops into Michigan, and the cholera killed about 10% of the population of Michigan Territory and delayed statehood for several years. So, anybody else?
Well, one thing I just,
You've
What?
been in trips to where Francis Scott Key's buried there at Frederick, Maryland?
I've been in Frederick. I have not been to
My
his.
ancestors are all buried within 100 to 150 feet from where his
Francis Scott Key. Yeah.
My ancestors all came from Baltimore area up to Frederick.
Yeah, his son had an interesting career, I guess. His son was also an attorney, and he was having an affair with the wife of, was it Dan Sickles? Yes, Congressman Dan Sickles, and Sickles shot him to death on the streets of Washington. And it was the first time that anybody got off on the temporary insanity plea. Anyway.
just the final thing, when I was doing a little research on the War 1812 and its aftermath, there was a very interesting quote which said, "A popular view is that everybody's happy with the outcome of the War 1812. Americans are happy because they think they won. The Canadians are happy because they know they won and avoided being swallowed by the United States. And the British are happiest because they've forgotten all about it." And of course, again, what isn't mentioned, the losers in this, once again, ended up being the Native American Indians.
Right.
Didn't matter which side you pick, you lost in the long run.
Well, another thing, just one little more. A friend and I were up in, we were near Niagara Falls at the reenactment of the Battle of Chippewa, which happened in 1814 and was about one of about 3 battles the Americans actually did win during the War of 1812. But anyway, we were walking through the Canadian camp, and there was a Canadian lady there cooking some food on the fire. And we were talking to her, and we said, "Oh, you know, it's almost the 4th of July." She said, "Yeah, I know." And so we said, "Well, we bet you celebrate not having become part of the United States." She looked at me and said, "Every day." So anyway, there it is.
Well, John, thank you so much again for your,
Yeah.
we'll go this way.
COVID elbow.
Thank you for coming in. You know you already have a challenge coin, so anyway, and you don't need a mug, I'm sure, but
There it
we
is.
want to give you a little something. And we hope that you'll come join us for future ones as well. Thank you very much. And again, I don't know if you've pointed out.
Yeah, anybody wants to come up and take a look?
I think you should put the hat on.
Yeah,
Oh, all right. Well,
yes.
Oh, man.
That's
That's-
cool.
oh, there.
That's cool.
Hey,
Oh,
that's-
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What's that?
We've got it right here in film.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, John,
Yeah.
you might mention about how the dress uniform at West Point goes back to the War of 1812.
Well, it does. The gray uniforms that are worn. Okay, here's the legend. The legend is that the troops under General Winfield Scott at the Battle of Chippewa were wearing gray jackets. And that was kind of a summer uniform for the United States Army. They were supposed to get the blue uniforms, but those have been waylaid by a scoundrel named General James Wilkinson or his troops, and so Scott's troops just had the gray jackets. So when they advanced toward the British at the Battle of Chippewa, the British commander said, "Oh, it's militia." But then he saw Scott's troops deploying in the battle line and advancing in perfect parade ground formation across the battlefield towards the British, and he said, "Those are regulars, by God." And that's the story of the Battle of Chippewa. Now, the story is that the cadets at West Point wear the gray uniform in honor of Scott's troops at the Battle of Chippewa. Actually, not true. Captain Partridge, who was in charge of West Point, was with the Rifle Regiment, one of the Rifle Regiments, and they had a gray uniform that he wore, and so the other cadets were put into the gray uniform according to his orders. So that's why, and not actually in honor of Winfield Scott's troops, but it's a great story.
That uniform is called dress gray. I wore it as a cadet for formal parades and stuff, and they still do. Although the daily uniform they wear now is what we call BDUs. It's the battle dress. So anyway, but thank you, John.
Sure.
Again, and please come up. Take appropriate distance, but.